Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Well, hey everybody, thanks for tuning in this week. Now, Gen Z, and again, that's referring to the slice of society that was born between the late 1990s and the early 2010s, so currently around 15 to 25 years old. They come up in our conversations quite a bit. In fact, Jim, you wrote a whole book about them back in 2017. Now, today we want to talk about a growing trend among Gen Zers to trade in their college prospects for tool belts. Or put another way, they're basically balking at the growing price of a college education, and they're opting instead to pursue vocational schools that offer, paid on-the-job training. Now, certainly, just the price tag of a college education alone isn't big enough a deterrent in and of itself, but I do kind of have a feeling that based on your research and your knowledge of Gen Z, maybe you detect a few other motivations for this switch. Am I right in that?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot more to this than just becoming a tool belt generation. First, just real quick, it's not just skipping college and learning a trade instead, but also going to college and then picking up the tool belt as well, just making that decision even after you've gone to college. I had some work done in my house a few weeks ago, plumbing, and I was talking to the plumber, young guy, and he said that he actually had been an English major in college and ended up a plumber. And he even said, go figure. And but I'm sure he's making, as he figures it, about 10 times more than he would teaching English somewhere, at least based on what he billed me. And but to your question, yes, I think there's more to it than just the cost of higher education. As I joked about my plumber, there really is often a better salary in the trades than in many of the jobs college might prepare you for. In fact, in digging around on this, I discovered that for the last 4 straight years, and this surprised me. The last 4 straight years, the median annual pay for new construction workers was higher than both professional services and the information sector, such as accountants or IT maintenance workers. Now, on average, professions dominated by college-educated workers generally earn more over time, but gosh, that first 5 to 10 year, no. And there's security in these jobs. And people inherently sense that there is security in these jobs. When you need a plumber, you need a plumber. And everyone at some point is going to need a plumber. And the rise of AI only adds to the sense of the need for job security, because if there's one thing that you don't hear about or them working on or many people fear is AI taking trade jobs. One survey I read that the majority of people now feel that blue-collar jobs, as they used to call them, offered better job security than white-collar jobs, again, because of AI. So the raw pay of these jobs, coupled with the sense that the money invested in a college degree doesn't pay off like it used to, it's a big driver. But I think there is something else at hand here. Once again, we can't forget the impact of the pandemic. A lot of particularly young folks watch their parents work at home during the pandemic, which meant watching them stare at their computers all day. And they decided, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to spend my life in front of a screen. In earlier generations, you don't know what your parents did when they went off to work. And now all of a sudden they were watching what they did. And it's like, I don't want to do that. And then to compound that, they were doing the same thing in terms of their own schooling. So they were seeing their parents do this. They were experiencing it in terms of their own schooling. It was just, more appealing to them to say, I want to get out and I want to do something. I want to do something with my hands, and in the sun and this, and see the sky. Just a sense of doing something physically and having that sense too, at the end of the day, of completion. And also being able to walk away from it. I read of one student who went into welding, and he said he was attracted to it because it had a lot of fire. And And I thought, I think that can be taken both literally and metaphorically for what is going on here. So it's no surprise that enrollment in vocational training programs is surging as uh, as overall enrollment in community colleges and four-year institutions has fallen. There was an article, and we'll link this in the show notes, in the Wall Street Journal. I think is the one that you and I maybe swapped with each other that started this whole conversation. But it cited the number of students enrolled in vocationally focused community colleges rose 16% last year. That's really a high percentage, bringing the number of students in that arena to the highest level since the National Student Clearinghouse began tracking. The number of students studying construction alone rose 23% since 2018. 23%. But studying Gen Z, like I have, you walk away struck by how much the appeal of being an entrepreneur is to this generation. It's really one of their defining marks. They really want to be entrepreneurs. And many are driven to or attracted to skill trades because there's a ton of entrepreneurial potential there. I read of one 18-year-old, 19-year-old who was attending trade school for automotive repair. And his plans were to, once he learned that trade and got some experience with automotive repair, to launch a mobile detailing company. And then he wanted to eventually expand that into custom body work. I mean, he had a whole trajectory planned out, very entrepreneurial. His father, who was a global technical sales director, did very well. He said, I really do expect my son to out earn me someday.
No, it's so interesting because as a millennial, it's amazing to see such a big switch in such a short amount of time, especially when it comes to just an attitude towards college education. Like when I was in high school, and again, I'm like a product of public school. I went to the largest state school in North Carolina. So even there, college was the expected next step. And the price tag was high even then as well. And it was just kind of taking out student loans were just an accepted, though necessary evil of the process. And even then, I'm talking 20 years ago, attending a community college as opposed to, a state or a private university just wasn't very common. But then you fast forward to this cultural climate of Gen Z, and the situation obviously couldn't be more different. More and more Gen Zers are taking college courses in high school to either save money or to get a jump start on their college careers, or they're choosing to save money by starting out in community colleges and for all of their gen ed classes, and then transferring to maybe their school of choice later on, or they're skipping traditional college altogether, choosing to attend vocational schools or taking classes remotely alongside full-time jobs. Now, you just outlined the personal motivations for them for this, but what about the larger cultural context? How has that encouraged, if not facilitated, thinking about college as just one option among many?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of dynamics at play here, which is why this is kind of an interesting conversation for me. First, you do have, as we've mentioned, I mean, you can't not acknowledge the incredible rising cost, even from when you went to college. I mean, the higher education and the virtual necessity now to use student loans to pay for it. I mean, it's just, I mean, public schools can be $40,000-$50,000 a year. I mean, it's just really quite high. Younger generations see what that has done to the generations before them in terms of being strapped with this massive amount of student debt, particularly if you go on from there and go on to something like law school or something like that, get a master's. And it's just not a pretty picture for them. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt with often very little to show for it economically. But another reason is the assessment of higher education itself. And this kind of falls into a couple of categories. The first is that higher education just isn't needed today for a good job. Not just because you can go the tool belt route, which we've been talking about, but because people look around and are seeing that you just don't need a degree for a lot of really good jobs. In fact, there was a study that was done by a labor analytics firm, Burning Glass Institute, and Strata, I think it's Strata Education Foundation, that half of college graduates end up in jobs where bachelor's degrees weren't even needed. Now that was really interesting to me. half of all college graduates that went to college because they wanted to get a better job, or at least that was what the narrative. And they ended up in jobs that didn't even need a degree. People are seeing that, and there's another assessment though, too. And that's there's a sense among many, particularly in Generation Z, that school just lacks purpose. And it just is not motivating. Schools are not engaging, and they're not engaging the students very well. They're much more excited. They're much more motivated for what is happening outside of the classroom. And this is starting early. This isn't just a college thing. This is starting in high school, and which is why it's coloring their view of college. Think of a high school student with interest in medicine. They're finding more fulfillment working part-time after school or on the weekends as like a part-time pharmacy technician. There they can tap into schools they could never practice in school, skills that they can never practice in school. There's just this feeling of disconnect with school, and students are just going through the motions while they're there. There was a new report from Gallup and the Walton Family Foundation, that surveyed more than 1,000 Gen Z students between the ages of 12 and 18, and found that less than half enrolled in middle school and high school felt any motivation whatsoever to go to school. The study found that the most influential driver of Gen Z students' happiness is their sense of purpose while at school, sense of purpose at work. This has forced educators in high schools and colleges nationwide to shift their strategies and their way of thinking to find ways to really try and engage students, such as offering. You hear administrators say, well, we just got to do better at offering elective classes, do better at offering internships that sync up with the interests that these students have in relation to their intended careers. And that in turn has led to a growing number of high schools valuing on-the-job training over post-secondary options, such as a 4-year college degree.
Now, what do you anticipate being the long-term result of this change, not only for Gen Zers, but just for our society in general in, 10 years?
I think it's great. I'll tell you why. And I mean, at least I'll give you my angle on why I think it's great. I mean, you can look at it and find some reasons why maybe it wouldn't be, but because I do lament the loss of English majors. I don't mean to pick on them, but the humanities, the liberal arts. I mean, even those that go to college, it's I'm going for business, I'm going for medicine, I'm going for law. You don't have English majors. In fact, it's a joke. If you're an English major, then you're why are you even going? You're just going into debt for nothing because you're not going to be able to do anything with it. Mm-hmm. So I lament that loss as someone who really appreciates the humanities and liberal arts. But having said that, this is why I think it's positive. I have often feared the loss of a certain kind of knowledge that, while needed in our world, or potentially will be needed in our world, is just not being passed down. And it's eventually going to fade away entirely, and we won't have access to it. For example, I don't know if you're familiar. I don't think we've never talked about it, and you probably aren't. But there's a series of books. The first one was published in 1972 called the Foxfire books. Have you ever heard of those?
Yeah. No.
And so the first one came out in 1972, and the goal was of this. Now there's like a collection that, like, I don't know, 8 or 10. The goal was to capture knowledge that was being lost. Specifically, these books were capturing the knowledge of self-sufficiency that had been present in the Southern Appalachians for generations. Things like crafts, how to weave, how to make butter, how to plant things, how to harvest things, how to build furniture, how to hunt and then skin an animal, how to cook without electricity. And these books captured all this and recorded how you did it before it's lost. Well, the trades are kind of a modern example of that until this recent resurgence, they were in decline, losing the knowledge of how to repair a car, how to do basic plumbing, how to weld something, carpentry skills needed to build a house. The average person didn't have any of that knowledge. So I think that in 10 years, if this continues, we'll see at least that body of basic knowledge preserved and passed on. And then if we all go out and buy the Foxfire books, we'll be okay with the knowledge before that. Another change I think we'll see down the road is a change in the economic and pedagogical model of education. It's going to change or die. It's just going to change or die. Schools will have to become more engaging, more cost-effective. They're going to have to become more relevant, more practical, and more strategic than they are perceived as being now.
Well, I'm going to broaden out this conversation a bit because you and I have had a number of conversations offline about the need for seminaries to adopt a similar approach, to do a better job preparing their students for vocational ministry rather than a life in academia. In fact, gosh, I apologize if I sound like a book rep for you at this point. I promise I get no cuts if people buy your books, but remind me, you did write a book about this. It's called What They Didn't Teach You in Seminary, and you did that as a former seminary president and professor. So can you share a little bit about your motivation in writing that?
Well, talking about what seminaries need to do differently would take at least an entire podcast, if not series of podcasts. But since you phrased the question around the nature of that book, like what prompted that particular book, and it's to this day, it's one of my favorites. I'm one of my favorite books. So let me stay focused. My life has been lived largely in two vocational worlds, the church and the academy. I'm the founding and senior pastor of a church. I am a professor and former president of a seminary. And I loved seminary. I loved learning about church history and theology and philosophy and ethics. My pulse quickened the first time I was able to actually say, in the Greek, this word means. I loved building my theological library from A to Z, meaning Augustine to Zwingli, adding multi-volume reference works like Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament made my hormones bubble. I was the classic 3-year residential MDiv. But toward the end of my seminary degree, just before I started my doctoral work, I received my PhD, followed immediately after my MDiv in my case. I received a call from a church near the school asking me to consider coming to Supply Speak. It's another story we can tell sometime. I was not their first choice. And that Supply turned into an interim, and then it was an established denominational church in a county seat town near the seminary. And then the interim, the Supply turned into an interim, and then the interim turned into a full-fledged invitation service or senior pastor. I had all this seminary knowledge. I knew nothing, though, about leading or serving, much less growing a church. It seems so ironic to say, doesn't it? So when I, as a new pastor, was asked to do bread and butter stuff, there's so much more complexity to ministry. People who think that, oh gosh, I want to go to ministry, I'll just work one day a week. You just go, wow, do you not know the job? But even what they might expand out, like officiating a wedding or officiating a funeral or a baptism, a communion, I was clueless. I didn't know any of even those most foundational basic things that, a staff person would be responsible for. So why did they ask me to be a pastor in the first place? It was assumed that since I was nearing my graduation from seminary, I knew what I was doing. I didn't. So in panic mode, I remember going to the seminary bookstore and buying, every minister's manual that had ever been printed. But it didn't really get any better. As my experience went forward, I needed to raise money to meet the church's budget, and there had never been a class on that. I wanted to try and grow the church numerically by reaching out to the unchurched, and my coursework had never touched on that. I had a problem with a combative and disagreeable deacon, and I searched through my seminary notes and found nothing about conflict resolution or dealing with, someone like that. I found I needed to be, in the office for administration, in my study to prepare talks, in people's lives to stay connected to the community, and in my home to raise my family. And there hadn't been any instruction on how to balance life like that or manage my time. it was becoming painfully clear how little my seminary education was actually preparing me for the day in, day out responsibilities of leading an organization in a community of faith. I knew about the Council of Nicaea, but no one had ever told me how to lead my own council meeting. I knew about the Bart-Brunner debate, but not how to handle the breakdown that happened between two Sunday school teachers when one was asked to start a new class for the same age group from the existing class, which didn't go over well with the other teacher. I knew the significance of the aorist verb in the Greek language, or at least Koine Greek, but not how to parse the culture to know how best to communicate to it. I could tell you the leading theologians of the 16th century, but I couldn't tell you about how to lead and manage a staff. This is why so many people look back on their seminary education. Sometimes, they go through it and they get drunk on the knowledge, and they love the education, but then they actually get out on the field and they start looking back on it with a critical eye, a jaundiced eye. It's why pastors will go to a 2-day leadership conference headlined by seasoned pastors passing on their insights for effective ministry, and feel like they gain more in those 2 days than they had in their entire 3 years of seminary education. Like so many others, I had gone to seminary to prepare for ministry, and I did not exit it prepared for ministry. I was prepared academically to begin a life of teaching, which is, of course, invaluable. But in terms of the vocation of ministry beyond teaching, and even in regard to teaching, you can have knowledge, you can have skills with working with scripture, but that doesn't make you an effective communicator. And, even effective communication is not often taught. Preaching, maybe, but not communication. There's another podcast on that one. But and then, if you do get involved in a larger church, or the church you plant or work with begins to take on size and has that kind of effectiveness and things, then it gets even more distance from anything that you might have learned when you're talking about leading a large staff and dealing with large budgets, and you're dealing with producing of resources, and you're dealing with you're a leader. You're a leader of an organization. MEC has a very large staff, ministry in 20 countries, and local partnerships with at least 20 more. We're 7 days a week effectively trying to engage and lead and advance the cause of Christ in a multifaceted, holistic way. We're busy. And there was no training for that. Now, even worse was how ignorant I was about the life of ministry. I didn't know how to, like I said, I didn't know how to manage my time. I didn't know how to care for myself spiritually, or raise my kids in a way that was sane and had them walk away from it all loving the church and loving ministry and loving Jesus. In other words, I never learned to do the things that I would actually have to do every day for the rest of my life. So I wrote the book. The way you through mentors that I had early on, and just by now as a man in his 60s who's been involved in this for 40 years, it's just like, could somebody put all this together, and how important it is for that kind of education. I love seminary, and we need seminary. But in fairness to a seminary education, there are certain things it will never be able to impart, even if it tried. I mean, God bless them. Most professors have never been the pastor of a church. They may have been interim pastors or had a seminary pastorate for a handful of months or a few years, but they are, in truth, academics. They are not practitioners. We need them, and we need the academic education that they give us, but we also need what they, as I don't teach you in seminary, we need insights and wisdom on leadership and relationships and emotional survival and communication hiring and firing and sexual fences and our struggle with envy and so many things. We need best principles about money and time and decision making and church growth. We are in the vanguard of engaging this culture for Christ. And we know how to parse the scriptures, but we don't know how to parse the culture. We can exegete the scriptures, we don't know how to exegete culture. And so as a result, we're not making often a dent in the unchurched population. So, and that only comes from someone who knows how to do it, or who has done it, or has learned how to do it. We need the raw street smarts that come from someone who has been educated in the trenches. So in relation to our conversation, I guess I was trying to bring a bit of a tool belt mentality to higher education. In this case, the graduate school, seminary.
Yeah. Well, I feel like MEC, and you just mentioned it a moment ago, but I feel like MEC is in many ways a living laboratory of what you were just riffing on, that, we have a young staff, many in their early 20s, and many of them have either bypassed college or are taking college classes, remotely or alongside their jobs online. And can you talk a little bit about how you've created a culture at MAC that does still promote or encourage a tool belt approach to ministry, but without sacrificing spiritual formation?
Well, young lady, I can't think of anyone better to answer that question than you. You serve on our pastoral team as head of our MEC Institute as well, our leadership development program. You work with staff mentoring efforts that we have, and on it goes. So why don't you talk about our culture and what it is we do? I don't know. I mean, you may have better insight into whatever I may have done or not done well in creating that culture, and maybe even explain some of those things I just mentioned. I'd love to. You okay with that? I'd love to hear you riff on that.
Well, I can take a stab at it, but certainly you fill in any gaps or anything that I'm missing. And I probably should start in full disclosure that I am in a bit of a unique situation, and that I am currently in seminary, and I have loved it. I've been thoroughly enriched by it. But while I've been in seminary for a handful of years, I've been in full-time ministry for much longer than that. And so having had both of those experiences, I can say that they beautifully complement one another. Neither one on its own has been able to fully equip me for the roles that I've had over the years. And yet, I would say I am a firm believer in the fact that while not everyone is called to seminary, everyone is called to ministry. And their ministry just may not be a paid staff member of a church. It might be in corporate America, or in their home, or in a classroom, or, it goes on and on. And while so many skills can be learned on the job, not all of them are. And I think especially as a Christian who seeks to live out their calling Christianly, like with the mind of Christ and emulation of him. We need more than just on the job training for that. We need to be trained in the Bible and in prayer and in the heart of God and wisdom. I often think about when God called the Hebrew people out of slavery, it's always really interesting to me that he didn't lead them directly to the promised land, which is where they wanted to go, but rather he led them first to Mount Sinai so he could give them the law, basically of saying, I am going to lead you and I'm going to be with you in the promised land, and you're going to learn a lot from that, but I need to show you who I am first. And I want to give you a vision for what I'm calling you to be. So it wasn't an either or. I feel like it was both. And so I feel like that's where what we've developed at MEC, it's something called the MEC Institute, but I feel like that's kind of where this comes into play, because it's a ministry at MEC that it predates me, so I'm not going to take credit for all that it is right now, but it's carried the same passion all of these years, which is to equip all believers for a variety of vocations, but to live whatever their calling is Christianly. And we often joke that it's like seminary, but for normal people and with no expense to it either. But, so yeah, we're not teaching Hebrew or Greek, at least not yet, but we are teaching, we're teaching theology. We're teaching church history and biblical hermeneutics, Christian classics, comparative worldviews. We teach on prayer and the study of the Bible and so on, but intentionally in a way that someone with no background in any kind of biblical education, never having attended a college, Christian class, they could understand it. and they could benefit from it, and they could immediately apply it in the context of whatever their current calling is. And then, I mean, we have more specific classes that touch on kind of unique circumstances of our lives, classes on singleness or marriage or parenting and finances, relationships, and so on. So it is a range, but despite that range, I feel like the focus and the goal of all of those classes is to provide students with, yes, head knowledge, but also immediate opportunities to embody that knowledge in the specific circumstances where they are. So I would say that MEC Institute and kind of that class range and our approach to be like seminary in that way is one way in which we do aim to bridge the gap between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. But there are other things that I think we do as well that you mentioned. I mean, we do have a spiritual mentoring program that we've developed. So it helps us to pair those who are further along in their faith or just in life with those who are newer, to be able to impart godly counsel to them, let them know what's up ahead, let them know that the knowledge that they have may be incomplete at this point, and kind of give them encouragement to move forward. You also mentioned we have a leadership development program, and I would say that does. It zeroes in on people who do feel called to lead and serve in the context of the church, whether that's, as a paid employee or just, as their calling as a volunteer. And so we give them training in that area. We give them, again, opportunities to apply that training in leadership positions. And the last thing that comes to mind, and this is larger than the Institute. It's just, I think it's just a MEC thing, in that you actually just talked about this recently in a staff meeting, but we really do. You've created this culture at MEC where it's legal, if not encouraged, for people to pursue their passions within the context of the church. So, for example, take those 20-year-olds that we have on staff. So many of them grew up at MEC, and while in their teenage years, they were given training and opportunities to chase their passions here, and in a wide variety of ways. I mean, it could have been children's ministry or teaching or the arts, music and design and videography and so on. And so when they graduated high school, they found that they didn't have to wait for their dream job. I was just talking to one of our staff who's in his 20s, and he's incredibly gifted in the arts. I remember talking to him about, whether he was taking classes or, how that decision came about. And he said, I had already, just as a teenager, been doing what I loved at MEC, and I was given opportunities to do that, and training to do that. So when I graduated from high school, I thought, I already have my dream job, and they're willing to provide me ongoing education, and I have freedom to do things that no one my age, gets to do, and just the freedom to pursue that now. So I don't need to go away to get the job that I already love and desire. Yeah. So he's been able to do that here, while also, taking some online classes here or there that, again, have immediate application for what he's doing. So, and I think that's my case too, honestly, because I mentioned I am in seminary. So it's been so sweet for me. Even though I had wanted to go to seminary way earlier in my life, I can see that it was such a blessing, the timing that I'm doing that now, because I can learn something in one of my classes, and then because I am in ministry, I can turn around the very next day and apply it. And I feel like that's seminary, and the knowledge that you gain at seminary is only as beneficial as it is given away, and only as beneficial as embodied. I think I read recently that our heads have so much greater capacity for theology than our hearts often do with love. And so I feel like that's been the beautiful thing about going to seminary and having this ability to put it into practice, is that I can do both, and I'm not getting stagnant in knowledge because I have immediate opportunities to apply it. So is that what you were hoping for?
That's great. That's really good. I appreciate you letting yourself kind of be put on the spot like that, because I think that churches need to learn from this whole conversation where the discontent is with education, and where, I maybe went a little bit of a riff on seminary, but I think that there is a sense where, okay, so is it a learning place? Is it a place where, your culture is that staff keeps learning, and they're given the time, space, resources to pursue education as needed, and the church celebrates that and facilitates that. Is there a sense where You do start this early on in the life of people, so that they grow up saying, "Gosh, I want to give my life to that. That's just way too much fun." And so, so yeah, I mean, I think that it is a culture, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's a culture that you create, a culture of encouragement, and a culture of practicality, a culture of learning, and we have it at every possible level. I mean, from you know all the way up to graduate degrees. So it's just so yeah. So thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. And thank you guys for your time and listening to it. And I hope to join us again next week.